I will tell you, Willie, when Fani Willis stood up, came into the room and said, I'm here, I'm going to take the stand, I thought, oh boy, everybody, everybody sit back. This is going to be something. She was defiant. She was upset. She was angry. And many would say she was asked a lot of degrading questions, and the entire thing was a bit of you-know-what show that she doesn't have time for, but she gave it to him, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, it was an incredibly dramatic scene. As she said, she testified later, she'd been pacing back and forth in her office listening to the previous testimony, and she went in, and remember, she was not supposed to appear. She wasn't going to appear for the subpoena. And she said, I'm ready. I want to do it. And just went and sat down in the witness stand. And it will continue this morning. She's not done yet. So Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis took the stand in Atlanta and delivered testimony in the evidentiary hearing regarding the misconduct allegations against her. This is an effort by Donald Trump and several of his co-defendants to have Willis disqualified and the election interference case dismissed. DA Willis, who initially tried to quash the subpoena for her testimony, withdrew that objection yesterday and accused the defense of lying about her relationship with Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade.
Mr. Wade visited you at the place you laid your head.
When?
Has he ever visited you at the place you laid your head?
So let's be clear, because you lied in this. Let me tell you which one you lied in. Right here. I think you lied right here. No. This is the truth, Judge. And it is a lie. It is a lie.
DA Willis holding up 3 pleadings filed by the defense there. Last month, Trump co-defendant Michael Roman, a longtime Republican opposition researcher who worked in the Trump administration, accused Willis and Wade of having an improper personal relationship and claimed Wade was hired for the job because of it. Willis did admit to the relationships, but she said it started after Wade was hired. Trump and several other co-defendants joined Roman's motion to try to remove Willis. When Roman's attorney, Ashley Merchant, accused Willis of not wanting to turn over records, Willis reminded her that she is not the one charged with a crime.
I object to you getting records. You've been intrusive into people's personal lives. You're confused. You think I'm on trial. These people are on trial for trying to steal an election in 2020. I'm not on trial, no matter how hard you try to put me on trial.
Earlier, Mr. Wade took the stand and testified to the timeline of his relationship with Willis and how the pair split the costs of trips and their dates, with Willis, he said, paying in cash. She confirmed that later. Before that, a former friend of DA Willis, who also worked inside the DA's office, her name's Robin Yurti, testified that Willis and Wade began dating in 2019. Disputing the timeline the couple had given. When pressed, it was revealed that Yurti had a falling out with Willis after she was forced out of the DA's office in 2022. Okay, with all of that said, let's bring in former U.S. Attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Joyce Vance, former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Glenn Kirshner. He's an MSNBC legal analyst, and former litigator and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Okay, let's begin left to right. How about that? We've got so many great legal minds here. Joyce, I'll start with you. The conventional wisdom seemed to be, after Mr. Wade's testimony, some said that this case was dead because of inconsistencies in the way that they were describing the relationship, because of the previous testimony of Ms. Yurti saying, no, actually, they were dating a long time before this. So, yes, maybe this was an improper relationship. Did DA Willis's testimony after Mr. Wade's do anything to change your mind about that?
So, you know, it may have changed the public impression of the hearing, but from the get-go, this was about whether the defendant could prove a conflict of interest existed under Georgia law that warranted disqualification for Fani Willis. And at least based on what we heard yesterday, maybe they'll have more today, but they came up short. They came up short in Wade's testimony. The witness, the friend who took the stand, was impeached. And this is the sort of thing that when you're presenting evidence, you don't want to have happen. But it turns out that this witness resigned in lieu of being fired from the district attorney's office. That threw her testimony about the timeline of the relationship into doubt. Ultimately, at the end of the day yesterday, it was just a big nothing burger, Willie. There was nothing that showed that Fani Willis and Nathan Wade had the sort of financial conflict of interest that Georgia law recognizes, something akin to a prosecutor who only gets paid if they win a case. That's the classic case at Georgia law where there's a conflict that results in disqualification. That just wasn't there yesterday in the courtroom.
So, Glenn, Joyce is right. We got deep in the weeds about how much cash did you pay for this dinner a couple of years ago. And D.A. Willis was saying, I don't remember. I don't keep receipts. She said she keeps large amounts of cash at homes and often pays her way in cash, splitting the bill with Mr. Wade on these dates. So you kind of got mired in all these details. But to pull way back, what did you see yesterday? What were the stakes? And did you see anything that would get rid of this case, that would push it down to someone else who may not take it up?
You know, Willie, as is always the case, I agree with Joyce. This is going nowhere. It will very soon be yesterday's news because there is no conflict, financial or otherwise. There's nothing that I saw in the testimony thus far recognizing additional witnesses will testify today, and the hearing is expected to go into next week. But I've seen nothing that has inured to the detriment of any defendant in the case. So I don't think the defense will be able to carry the burden. What I do think is what we saw yesterday is a tribute to the value of cameras in the courtroom, because as you watch D.A. Willis testify, I would be hard-pressed to believe that anything she said was a misrepresentation, was inaccurate, or was untruthful. She was angry, and she had every right to be angry. She was holding up public court filings that she contended contained all sorts of lies. And once they go out into the public square, people are going to believe those lies. She was hot, but she had every right to be hot. She remained respectful but forceful, and I don't think this hearing will win the defense any relief whatsoever.
News out of Russia. We're getting reports that jailed opposition leader, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is now dead. That is according to the Russian prison service. He was 47 years old. He spent his final months behind bars as the Russian leader reshaped the country to rally behind his war in Ukraine. We have a lot more to talk about in terms of his life. This is a man who really dedicated his life to opposing Putin's reign. He rose to prominence as Russia's most outspoken Kremlin critic. He was poisoned at one point. He'd been imprisoned many times. He even tried to run against Vladimir Putin in 2018 in the presidential election, but was barred from entering the race, and they kept finding reasons to throw him in jail. Again, Alexei Navalny is dead.
As Russia's leading opposition figure, Alexei Navalny piled pressure on the Kremlin and put a target on his back. Born in 1976 in what was then the Soviet Union, Navalny trained as a lawyer and rose to prominence as a political blogger. In 2011, he started the Anti-Corruption Foundation, which exposed the extravagant wealth of Russian officials, including President Vladimir Putin.
The biggest thing that Putin is afraid of is public discontent in Russia, and that is why it's so afraid of opposition leaders.
Navalny's and Putin's stars were intertwined. As Putin tightened his grip on power, Navalny became a leading figure at anti-government protests. "We will force them to live by the law because we hold the power here," he shouted. He was arrested countless times and turned attacks to his advantage. In 2017, after announcing his intentions to run for president, Navalny was attacked with green dye twice. "Maybe the Kremlin thinks that I will not record videos with a green face," he said, "but now even more people will watch." In 2019, as Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation gained support nationally, police raided their offices and arrested several activists, including, of course, Navalny. But in 2020, his life was threatened like never before. On a plane traveling from Siberia to Moscow, Navalny became deathly ill. He fell into a coma and was put on a ventilator. While recovering in a German hospital, investigators revealed he had been poisoned with Novichok, a Soviet-era neurotoxin. Navalny blamed Putin for the attack, a claim the Kremlin denies. Miraculously, Navalny recovered and participated in the investigation into his own poisoning, documenting the whole thing on social media. Despite the threats against his life, in January 2021, Navalny and his wife Yulia voluntarily returned to Moscow, where he was immediately arrested, ostensibly for violating the terms of a 2014 embezzlement case. Once in jail, he was tried and sentenced to more than 9 years in a maximum security prison. Navalny said the charges were politically motivated. But even behind bars, he found ways to make his voice heard, using social media to protest the Ukraine war and needle those in power. His legacy is one of defiance, a constant thorn in the side of the Kremlin. Richard Engel, NBC News.
And again, we're talking today about the legacy of Alexei Navalny, who has died at the age of 47 in a Russian prison. As Willie pointed out, this is a man with a family who has lived with this type of threat in their lives since they knew him. And now the worst has happened. Willie?
Let's bring into the conversation the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker. He joins us by phone from the Munich Security Conference, where many world leaders are gathered today. Peter, what's the early reaction to this news there?
Yeah, Willie, obviously there's shock here in Munich. You're right. A lot of world leaders, a lot of European leaders are here to talk about security in Europe. And, of course, Russia is front and center. I'm here with the Vice President Kamala Harris, who's supposed to give a speech at 8:30 a.m. your time, East Coast time, and she's already planning to talk about, this confrontation with Russia. Obviously, the death of Alexei Navalny will, add an obvious urgency to that conversation. He was well respected, especially here in Germany, where they rescued him once he was poisoned by Vladimir Putin's FSB, and he decided, against all advice, I think, to return to Russia, knowing that he would be very likely locked up. And as we know from history, if you go into one of Vladimir Putin's prisons, you're very likely not going to come out.
So, Peter, Jonathan just reminded us that he had a conversation with the president back in 2021 at a summit in Geneva, where he asked very pointedly, if Alexei Navalny is killed, if he dies in a prison in Russia, what would be the consequences? And President Biden responded, I told President Putin that the consequences would be devastating, his word, for Russia. What should we take that to mean?
Well, it's hard to know. In 2021, of course, we hadn't yet seen the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we had therefore not yet taken a lot of the measures that we have taken since then, the United States, that is, against Russia in terms of sanctions and so forth. It's hard to know what additional measures that they have available to them to respond to this that they haven't already taken for the invasion of Ukraine. But I imagine the pressure is going to be rather significant on the Biden administration to find a way to respond and make clear that this is not, accepted in the West. Nobody's going to believe the Russian story that he suddenly collapsed on his own on a walk while in prison. It's just not. It's not going to sell. But the tools available to the Biden administration, I'm not clear what they would be at this point that they haven't already used to try to punish them for Ukraine. And maybe that's why Vladimir Putin or his government decided there would be no significant consequences if something like this happened. And that's an open question.
We haven't confirmed the circumstances of Navalny's death, but as Peter says, the Russian prison service claims he went for a walk and collapsed. We should point out just in the last couple of days, Navalny appeared for a hearing while he was in prison, was smiling and laughing through that, as he often does. So, Peter, we've been talking about the way that Republicans in the Senate, Republicans in the House lately in particular have been talking about Russia. Of course, how Donald Trump has talked about Russia and Vladimir Putin for a long time in glowing terms. Senators this week saying Putin's on top of his game. We shouldn't fund Ukraine because it has no chance to beat the powerful army of Russia, on and on and on. Do you think the death of Navalny changes any of the calculus in the Congress right now about getting aid to Ukraine?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think it changes Donald Trump's calculus. He never cared much about dissidents to begin with. I don't think he ever cared much about Alexei Navalny. And as long as he's still in taking the same position that he takes, I think that, we've seen that's dispositive right now with a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill. As long as he is against aid for Ukraine, a lot of Republicans are going to go along with him despite what's happened now to Alexei Navalny. But I think you're right that it adds a certain a moral clarity, I think, for the argument that people who are for Ukraine aid will look at this and point to this and say, don't forget who's on the other side of this war. Don't forget who is in the Kremlin pulling the strings here and what they're capable of, because, Alexei Navalny was seen by Vladimir Putin as a potential threat to his rule, and he paid the price for it. And I think that's a reminder of what kind of government there is right now in Moscow.
Let's bring in former U.S. ambassador to Russia, now director of the Institute for International Studies at Stanford, and an NBC News international affairs analyst, Michael McFaul. Ambassador, thanks for being with us. I mentioned a few minutes ago on this show your reaction on Twitter. I'd like to hear more from you here, and also what more you're hearing about this from your contacts inside Russia.
Guys, I don't know what to say. I'm going to try to be analytic, but I want you to know Alexei Navalny was my friend. I was with his wife last night. I'm here in Munich talking to her. Yeah. His daughter, Dasha, goes to school at Stanford. So this is a pretty emotional time for me. Putin killed Navalny. Let's be crystal clear about that. I don't care about any investigation, his ill health, arrested. He had him in solitary confinement. He has put him in a cell which was designed to, and today he is dead. Putin killed Navalny. And why did he? Because Putin is weak. You don't kill people if you're strong. Putin killed Navalny because Navalny was the one opposition leader in Russia that Putin feared the most. So this is a really tragic day for me, and it should be a tragic day for anybody who cares about democracy. Navalny, in my view, was put him in the category of brave, courageous leaders that, remember, he went back to Russia. He didn't have to go back. He went back for his country because he was a patriot that believed that his country could be different. I put him in the same ranks as the Navalny of Mandela and Valensa and Havel, but with one tragic difference now. Navalny is dead.
Ambassador, I'm so sorry. I know he was a close friend of yours, and I didn't know you were with his wife last night. Can you remind our viewers, because sometimes it's lost, they know the name, but they don't know the full story, about the lengths to which Alexei Navalny went to fight the corrupt government, the authoritarianism of Vladimir Putin? As you said, even after he was poisoned, he voluntarily returned to this country. He spoke out in a way that ultimately cost him his life.
Well, that's right. So let's remember, yes, Alexei Navalny was a young opposition leader, mostly focused on anti-corruption. And what corrupt leaders fear the most are foundations, his anti-corruption foundation that was focused on that. And back in 2011 and 2012, when there were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow, I think a lot of Americans and maybe most of the world have forgotten that. But that's when I was ambassador. There were hundreds of thousands of people rallying at Navalny's demonstrations, anti-corruption and for democracy. And it was, I think, important to remember that there was a time when millions of people supported people like Mr. Navalny. He ran for mayor in the following year, in 2013. He was not allowed to campaign. He was not allowed on TV. And he gained almost a third of the votes. So he was a popular leader that, remember, Putin tried to kill him before. He poisoned him very clearly. He was shipped out of Germany. They barely survived. And on that moment, he finally recovered. Many people said, Alexei, do not go back. I was in touch with him right before he flew back. But he said to me, Mike, this is my country. I'm not going to let this guy chase me out of it. And as he arrived, they put him in prison. They arrested him. He's been in prison ever since. And that the conditions under which he's been living over the last several years have been worse and worse and worse. And gradually that, I think, well, let's wait till we see all the autopsy and all that. But let's be crystal clear. They were slowly killing him, and he was killed today because he was the greatest threat to Putin's corrupt rule.
Survived starvation, poisoning, incarceration, being beaten, and he knew that every day of his life could be the last one. Here he is on 60 Minutes back in 2020.
I think for Putin, why he's using this chemical weapon to do both, kill me and, terrify others. It's something really scary with the people just drop dead there are no guns, there are no shots, and in a couple of hours you will be dead and without any traces on your body. It's something terrifying, and Putin is enjoying it.
You have said you think that Mr. Putin's responsible.
I don't think, I'm sure that he's responsible.
Richard Engel, what can you add to the legacy of Alexei Navalny and what he has done literally with his life, putting it on the line and losing it in the name of freedom and transparency and exposing Vladimir Putin? Do you think it will have an impact in Russia?
Well, he is now a martyr in Russia, and he put his life on the line. He knowingly put his life on the line. So this is someone who was a constant critic of Vladimir Putin, going to social media, exposing corruption of Putin and his inner circle, talking about Putin's billion-dollar dacha, talking about yachts owned by members of the people around the Kremlin and around Putin, and not being shy to talk about the most sensitive things in Russia, Vladimir Putin and his family even. And then after being arrested numerous times, after being attacked with green dye in order to try and make him look ridiculous and intimidate him, he was ultimately poisoned with Novichok, nearly killed. After recovering in Germany, he decided to go back. He decided to go back with his wife, and he knew that as soon as he got off that plane and set foot in Moscow, he would be arrested, and he was. And as soon as he arrived back in Russia, he was sent to prison, first not far from Moscow, and then in December he was transferred to this gulag in Siberia, about 2,000 miles away. He actually went missing for a period. Even his inner circle, his lawyers, didn't know where he was until he turned up at this a polar wolf facility, a penal colony north of the Arctic Circle for about 1,000 men. And according to prison officials, that's where he died this morning. He took some walk, according to their account, and then collapsed, lost consciousness. They tried to revive him and were unsuccessful. And according to the prison authority, according to TASS, the Russian news agency, Vladimir Putin has been informed of his death. But Navalny's own team say that they haven't confirmed his death, and his lawyer is on his way right now to the penal colony to try and gather information. It will be extraordinarily difficult to find out what happened inside that facility for his team and, frankly, for anybody. But this will be a story that journalists, I'm sure, will be working on from now and for years to come to figure out what exactly killed him. Was it duress? Was it the pressure on him, accumulated years of mistreatment, or did something more sinister, even more sinister, happen earlier today?